Saturday, December 19, 2015, sent via Facebook. Uncle David, I'm sorry to message you this way so informally, but as time has gone on, this is the only way that I have contact with you. It seemed like the quickest way in this day and age to reach someone. I just wanted to let you know that Nana passed away last night in her sleep. There's obviously been family tension over the years, but I wanted to let you know. I'm sorry, and I hope all is going well. Nana was my mother and my nephew's grandmother. The Facebook message did not sadden me. News of my mother's death related to me in a social media message seemed like just another piece of information to absorb during just another day of thoughts, ideas, decisions, actions, and consequences. My nephew's family, including my sister and her husband, along with our mother, moved out of state without saying a word to me or my brother Douglas. Partly out of skepticism and to avoid speculation, I contacted the Vermont Department of Health to purchase a death certificate. I learned from the death certificate that my mother hadn't finished her high school education. The cause of death was listed as being related to heart disease. She was 86 years old. I began to ponder my lack of emotion over her passing. I didn't feel an overwhelming sense of grief or loss. Should I hate myself for this lack of emotion? Should I feel guilty? Do I have mental problems, or am I just insensitive? Is this due to my generally suspicious nature? How much of this lack of emotion over my mother's passing resulted from growing up during a highly disruptive and frightening era?
Nobody is safe.
This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. We're in the thermonuclear era.
The first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the USSR.
This is a Colorado radio alert.
It began the first week of the year when Castro's revolution overthrew the Batista regime. Within a few weeks, 250 men faced firing squads throughout the country.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
This is not the first time that a small band of freedom fighters has engaged the armor of totalitarianism. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner.
Something has happened in the motorcade route. There has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
Oswald has been shot.
This afternoon, 4 persons, including 2 women, were shot and killed on the campus during renewed demonstrations.
Orgy of violence, arson, and insanity. How do you explain that social phenomenon?
Viet Cong, taking advantage of the noisy celebration, launched a savage attack on Saigon. Areas of the city became a blazing inferno.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside a Memphis motel this afternoon.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible?
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The plan was for a helicopter evacuation from the embassy grounds, and the embassy was stormed, so people fought and clawed their way over that wall.
There were 75 million other children and young adults in my baby boom generation. We lived our formative years through the most intense period of the Cold War. Violent disorder of the 1960s.
July 1967, Newark, New Jersey goes up in flames, reacting to a rumor that police had beaten and allegedly killed a local man. Residents protested. For 6 days, state troops and police clashed in the streets with rioters. 26 people were killed. 6 days later, it happened again in Detroit, Michigan.
Detroit. It looked like the wartime blitz on London, but this was no war. It was arson, looting, a race riot blown up into something beyond control.
Triggered by another police action and another angry protest gone haywire, The destruction of downtown Detroit was worse than Newark's. As reports poured in of snipers shooting at police, President Lyndon Johnson called in the Army to put an end to the violence. 5 days on, 43 people were dead, hundreds wounded, and block after block of inner-city Detroit was destroyed. It wasn't just Newark and Detroit that erupted that year. Scores of other cities were under siege.
In 1967, 126 cities were hit by racial violence, with 75 incidents classified as major riots.
A social revolution. This included soaring divorce rates suffered by millions of American families. Continuous social upheaval combined with the very real threat of nuclear war.
The United States is under attack. Enemy missiles are on the way. All citizens must go to the nearest shelter immediately.
Follow the signs to the safety of shelter.
Really worried me as a young child. All of that was happening amid frequent family conflicts over religion, child-rearing, and alcoholism. This conflict led to my parents' divorce during my teenage years. The combination of my own family's battles and society generally in turmoil, plus normal childhood struggles, affected me tremendously. Being resourceful and finding intellectual pursuits sometimes soothed the emotional pain, confusion, and fears. Thinking back to 1959 and third-grade classes at Seth G. Haley School in West Haven, Connecticut, the first thing to come to mind is the bomb.
Let's face it, the threat of hydrogen bomb warfare is the greatest danger our nation has ever known. Enemy jet bombers carrying nuclear weapons can sweep over a variety of routes and drop bombs on any important target in the United States. The threat of this destruction has affected our way of life in every city, town, and village from coast to coast. These are the signs of the time. Only in practice now, a rehearsal, a training exercise. But tomorrow this siren may mean the real thing.
Instructional films and emergency drills were part of our daily lives. Fear of the atom bomb was firmly planted in our young subconscious minds.
It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings.
National and world events throughout the 1950s and early 1960s were disturbing. The constant conflict could not be ignored. The threat of annihilation was very, very real. Yellow fallout shelter signs indicating shelter locations were all over the country.
Throughout our nation today, these signs have become a familiar sight in and on many of our buildings.
The National Fallout Shelter Program, the shelter system designed for survival, requires the cooperation of all of us in every state and every community throughout the nation.
Shelters were stocked with large, dark green barrels of water and cardboard boxes of basic food. Many families had basement fallout shelters in their homes. I remember being hysterical and pleading with my father to build us a bomb shelter when I was 6 or 7 years old. It was an awful time for young children. I felt powerless. We experienced world events on primitive black and white television sets. There were 3 choices for national news: ABC, CBS, or NBC. Nightly news programs brought world events into our homes.
It seemed that almost daily, Soviet leaders told us that they were going to annihilate us.
Конец! Могила колониальному рабству! Долой его! И похоронить его чем глубже, тем лучше!
Premier Nikita Khrushchev spoke aggressively.
The possibility of atomic war with the Soviet Union haunted me during the 1950s and 1960s. After all, the The Soviet Union beat America in the early years of the space race.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York.
There are precious few scientific details being divulged. The headlines are about glorious victory of Soviet science.
Now the world knows that it took a far more powerful projectile than America possesses to push that satellite into its orbit in space. In view of that, Russia's threats may be more effective from now on.
This gave rise to national debate about a missile gap and a bomber gap.
This presentation will highlight some significant aspects of the development of the Soviet ICBM threat to the United States. By 1 January 1960, some 21 ICBMs had been fired from Tyura-Tan. This indicates a continuously progressive R&D program has been energetically carried on by the Soviets for 10 years or more. It introduces a new dimension to surprise and forces us to reassess our own strategic position and re-evaluate the Soviets' ability to deal a crippling blow. The attacker who can launch a large-scale surprise attack in a very short time now has a tremendous advantage which could well result in immediate destruction or paralysis of the victim's capacity to resist and prevent him from making a devastating counterattack.
Some believed the Soviet Union's atomic arsenal outnumbered America's capabilities. A spy mission to get aerial photos was vital. Francis Gary Powers flew a U-2 spy plane across the Soviet Union at about 70,000 feet, but was shot down May 1, 1960.
Pilot, aircraft, and film in hand, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev launched a propaganda campaign that greatly humiliated the Eisenhower administration. Khrushchev demanded an apology, and Eisenhower steadfastly refused. Powers was tried and convicted of espionage. After serving 18 months of a 10-year sentence, he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet agent serving 30 years in a federal prison for spying.
The ensuing space race with the Soviet Union was exciting.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce to you 7 Americans, gentlemen all, Americans, Mercury, astronauts!
On September 12, 1962, President Kennedy made a startling announcement at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
Pilots and astronauts were my heroes back then. Learning to fly was a childhood dream. At home, our family's unhappiness was compounded by a religious split. My father's conservative Jewish family was headed by Russian immigrant parents who strictly adhered to religious law. I vividly remember visiting my elderly grandfather during Jewish Sabbath, watching him read the Old Testament Bible by the flickering light of a single candle on a small kitchen table. My mother was a product of divorced parents. Her mother was part Irish, and her father was a strict Italian Roman Catholic. Both of my parents wanted their children to study each other's religion. For the Catholic faith, it was catechism class taught by nuns. For the Jewish faith, it meant learning Hebrew as a prelude to bar mitzvah. My mother demanded stricter discipline to enforce attendance. Dad wanted his children to be independent and choose a religion for themselves. No wonder they grew apart. Our family of 5 was adrift in choppy seas between the two religions. We were not really accepted by either family. It didn't help to have a father who spent many hours at work and a mother who, like her mother, was an alcoholic. Little was known then about the effects of smoking and drinking during pregnancy. My mother smoked and drank, probably contributing to her children's health problems later in life. Lacking a sense of belonging at home, in school, or on the street with the neighborhood kids, just getting to school was a daily challenge. The short walk through my predominantly Roman Catholic blue-collar neighborhood was an everyday hazard. Some seriously mean big boys loved to belittle me for my Jewish background. Being overweight compounded the insults. Back then, nobody made a big deal of bullying. It was just a part of growing up, but it influenced my self-esteem, and I became withdrawn.
Bullying, depression, and suicide.
It is true that individuals that are bullied and those that bully have a higher risk of depression and mental health problems.
James Wright is at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Kids who bully and kids who get bullied may internalize their problems, have low self-esteem, and aggression.
And these characteristics also further raise the risk for suicide.
My emotional escape was to tinker with old radios alone in the basement, or explore books in the local library. Radio was my first encounter with technology. No one could have imagined the powerful role technology would play in our lives and careers. During the 1950s and early 1960s, television was my babysitter. At age 7, the TV program Rescue 8 was a favorite of mine.
Watching a rescue team in action. One of 27 such teams attached to the fire department of Los Angeles County. 5.5 million people in this area are dependent on their ability to act swiftly and efficiently in any emergency.
Firefighting was a source of excitement for me as a preteen male. Blasts from the fire horn on the roof of the nearby West Shore Fire Department rudely announced emergencies. The horn blasts summoned volunteers to a specific location. I decoded the horn blast sequence using a chart given to me by a volunteer fireman who lived next door. If the incident was close by, I rushed to the scene on my bicycle to watch the firefighters in action. This early fascination with firefighting would have practical implications for my future career. Television news reports of the disastrous 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba were followed by the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone anxiously watched President John Kennedy address the nation from the Oval Office.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact
Saturday, December 19, 2015, sent via Facebook. Uncle David, I'm sorry to message you this way so informally, but as time has gone on, this is the only way that I have contact with you. It seemed like the quickest way in this day and age to reach someone. I just wanted to let you know that Nana passed away last night in her sleep. There's obviously been family tension over the years, but I wanted to let you know. I'm sorry, and I hope all is going well. Nana was my mother and my nephew's grandmother. The Facebook message did not sadden me. News of my mother's death related to me in a social media message seemed like just another piece of information to absorb during just another day of thoughts, ideas, decisions, actions, and consequences. My nephew's family, including my sister and her husband, along with our mother, moved out of state without saying a word to me or my brother Douglas.
Partly out of skepticism and to avoid speculation, I contacted the Vermont Department of Health to purchase a death certificate.
I learned from the death certificate that my mother hadn't finished her high school education. The cause of death was listed as being related to heart disease. She was 86 years old. I began to ponder my lack of emotion over her passing. I didn't feel an overwhelming sense of grief or loss. Should I hate myself for this lack of emotion? Should I feel guilty? Do I have mental problems, or am I just insensitive? Is this due to my generally suspicious nature? How much of this lack of emotion over my mother's passing resulted from growing up during a highly disruptive and frightening era?
Nobody is safe.
This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. We're in the thermonuclear era.
The world, including my neighborhood, to the brink of atomic warfare and nuclear devastation. Events like that crisis made a big impression on me. It fostered interest in Cuba, the CIA, early spy satellites, and espionage. I loved going to see James Bond movies.
The purpose of our two previous encounters is now very clear to me. I do not intend to be distracted by another. Good night, Mr. Bond.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
My fascination with spying might have been a way to confront unknowns in life, strengthening a skeptical if not suspicious nature. Some say discussion, debate, and argument are associated with Judaism. If that's true, then Russian Jews might be even more suspicious. Could my father's side of the family have influenced the way I think?
Jewish history has been going on for a very long time, almost 4,000 years since Abraham, the first Jew, and over 3,300 years since we stood at Sinai and received the Ten Commandments and the Torah. Jewish history is a continuum, and it should be viewed in that context. The past is directly connected to our present, and both the past and the present, whether we understand it or not, will in one way or another impact on our future.
In the early 1900s, there were 10.5 million Jews in the world. The majority of them, 7.5 million, lived in Russia and Eastern Europe. Today, 80% of the American Jewish population originally comes from the Russian Empire.
You're talking about an autocratic, dictatorial rule that had no room for the other.
You are a psychiatrist. It's very interesting. This is exactly what I need.
All you need is what every Czech needs, a stiff Russian boot up your behind.
It's a pity they don't make Russian boots anymore. They're all made in China. Dr. Bennell, you have the honor of meeting one of Washington's most notorious diplomats, my friend and the source of this exquisite caviar, Russian Ambassador Yurish Kaganovich.
Nice to meet you, Ambassador.
My cheeky friend and I pretend to enjoy ourselves, but secretly we are bitter rivals, exploiting each other for personal gain. I am here to drink his expensive champagne, and he invites me because I can get the real caviar. A veneer of civility hides our true self-interest. I say that civilization is an illusion, a game of pretend. What is real is the fact that we are still animals, driven by primal instincts. As a psychiatrist, you must know this to be true.
To be honest, Ambassador, when someone starts talking to me about the truth, what I hear is what they're telling me about themselves more than what they're saying about the world.
Quite right. Well done, Doctor.
Well, perhaps you're right. Perhaps being a Russian in this country is a kind of pathology.
At age 11 or maybe 12, the need to explore what was beyond our neighborhood appealed to me. From a nearby bus stop, the half-hour ride to downtown New Haven offered new possibilities, including a much larger public library. This early independence freed me from the confinement of our small Cape Cod-style home in West Haven. I needed to be independent to survive. It seemed like my mother was drinking with increasing frequency. Getting as far away as possible was a means of avoiding frequent arguments with her. Today, a 12-year-old youngster traveling alone on an inner-city bus might be considered criminal child neglect. Dad worked long hours and wasn't home much. There were only 2 family vacations during the time I lived with both parents. My sister and brother were younger, and we didn't interact much. Getting out of the house and pursuing my own interests was probably the only thing that kept me sane. Becoming a cadet in the Civil Air Patrol provided some military-style discipline and structure. Aerospace education, search and rescue training, and a few friendships were additional attractions. The nearest squadron meetings took place in the neighboring town of Milford. Mom would drop me off, and a CAP vehicle took me to the Quonset Hut headquarters building outside of town. After a 2-hour meeting, they'd return us to downtown. Mom told me to wait for her at a particular spot in Milford's downtown area. She didn't anticipate that the cold afternoon weather would turn into a rainy and cold evening, or that she would be an hour late one night. I went into a pharmacy to get out of the rain, but kept a lookout for my mother. It took much longer for her to find me, and she was aggravated. There were many childhood disappointments. Friday afternoon, November 22, 1963, the Seth G. Haley Elementary School's public address system came alive with the shocking announcement that President John F. Kennedy had been shot. We were immediately sent home. Suddenly, the blur of the events on television became our window on the world.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
It all happened in only 74 hours. The shooting of the president in Dallas on Friday afternoon, the arrest of a suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, just 80 minutes later, Jack Ruby's execution of Oswald Sunday morning, JFK's burial in Arlington Cemetery on Monday afternoon. Like most Americans, we were transfixed by the television images, bewildered by the rapidly unfolding drama that weekend. This experience intensified my interest in news and current affairs. President Lyndon Johnson appointed the Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, commonly called the Warren Commission. When the Commission's final report was issued nearly a year after the assassination, there were many citizens who were suspicious of the Warren report.
Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight's guest, Mark Lane. Our topic, the Warren Report. Fact or fiction, Mr. Buckley?
Mr. Mark Lane has been around for many years, identifying himself gladly with causes worthy, controversial, and unworthy. He was, in short, a hero in important circles in New York well before the assassination of President Kennedy by whoever assassinated President Kennedy. Mr. Lane is a skillful lawyer and has written a best-selling book called Rush to Judgment. It is widely alleged that sinister forces who have a vested interest in suppressing the real truth as to the identity of the assassin have been here and there killing off crucial people, former strippers at Ruby's joint in Dallas, truck driver roommates of friends of Oswald, that kind of thing. How come, if you were the man who has changed history, these forces haven't bumped you off?
Well, I think, fortunately, we haven't come to that. Of course, the Lou Harris poll shows now that 2/3 of the American people indicate that they cannot accept its conclusions.
Their suspicion spawned conspiracy theories that seem even more realistic today.
Who benefited?
You have any idea what you're getting yourself into, Daddy-O?
Who has the power to cover it up?
I'm a dead man!
I say let justice be done though the heavens fall.
Meanwhile, an interest in radio quickly became a near obsession. A friend of the family helped me pass the Morse code test and a written exam for a novice class ham radio license. After more study and practice with Morse code, I took the train by myself to New York City, about 75 miles away. Arriving at Grand Central Terminal, I walked to the FCC office, where I took and passed the more difficult code and theory tests for a general class amateur radio license. I felt like I had achieved something substantial. For the first time in my young life, I was proud of a significant accomplishment. This theme of self-motivation, challenge, success, and reward was the first step in building up my low self-esteem. Photography became my second major passion. I purchased a camera and taught myself how to shoot pictures, develop film, and print photos. This specialized knowledge of photography elevated an enthusiastic young teenager to the status of being the photographer. I learned that the local daily newspaper needed someone to occasionally shoot photos at high school events. During 1967, at age 16, getting a Connecticut driver's license led to even more independence. The $200 saved from a part-time job at a radio station bought an old Ford Falcon. This new mobility, plus a car radio I converted to receive police and fire calls, enabled me to act on earlier interest in firefighting. I began to shoot pictures of accidents and fires and offer them to people at the newspaper. The freedom to travel on my own, especially at night on the deserted streets of nearby downtown New Haven, was exciting. This was a great getaway from the stress of living with my mother while her divorce from my father went forward. News photography provided a real purpose in my life. On the rare occasion when one of my pictures was published in the New Haven Register, the pay was $3 and a roll of film. More importantly, I was proud to see "Photo by David Vine" just below my published photo. My interest in photojournalism accelerated.
Photojournalists seek the truth. They feel that it's important for people around the world to know the truth about the world. Truth is the objective of good journalism. Beauty is secondary to the truth, but the great photographers usually manage to get pictures which are not only truthful but beautiful. The editor chooses among those pictures to tell it as it was, or was it? Right or wrong, the picture is the last word.
Isolation and loneliness, especially during childhood, led to a sense of emotional detachment. The camera was a convenient emotional barrier against the tragic events that summoned me, like a moth drawn to a lighted candle. The late 1960s docu-fiction movie David Holtzman'S Diary captivated me when I saw it recently. In the movie, the fictional David Holtzman is a filmmaker seeking a better understanding of his life. The similarity to my situation at that age really resonated with me.
Your fucking self. People, events seem to speak to me. They seem to carry some meaning that I can't quite get. Film is truth 24 times a second. So I thought that if I put it all down on film and I run it back and forth, I should get it all. I should get it all. I should get the meaning. I should understand it. What you want to do is find things about your life. Find out the truth. There's something that happens that you don't understand. You want to get to the core of it. Well, David, I don't think you're going to find it this way, because if something happens and you don't understand it, you're not going to understand it any better by freezing it on celluloid and looking at it over and over again. You don't understand the basic principle. As soon as you start filming something, whatever happens in front of the camera is not reality anymore. It becomes part of something else.
The emotional battering of major events on the national stage continued. During 1968, 5 years after President Kennedy's assassination, both Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and presidential candidate Robert Kennedy were assassinated within a few months of each other. The King assassination led to race riots that raged throughout the country. New Haven was hit hard. A few nights after King was gunned down in Memphis, firefighters battled several major fires in New Haven. From his small discount store in West Haven, my father and I saw a big orange glow in the sky from burning buildings about a mile away. He drove me to within a couple of blocks of the fire scene, and I shot these photos. This one ran on page 1 of the newspaper. In America, during the 1960s, hundreds of local, state, and national groups were more or less allied to radical leftist or communist ideologies. After the 1965 assassination of Nation of Islam leader Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party was organized in California. They followed the radical teaching of Malcolm X.
The Panthers followed Malcolm's belief of international working-class unity across the spectrum of color and gender, and thus united with various minority and white revolutionary groups. From the tenets of Maoism, they set the role of their party as the vanguard of the revolution and worked to establish a united front, while from Marxism they addressed the capitalist economic system and represented the need for all workers to forcefully take over the means of production.
Free enterprise and capitalism has only been destructive to black people, and we're demanding a drastic change.
The party spreads its roots further into the political spectrum, forming coalitions with various revolutionary parties.
There are two types of oppression. One is exploitation, the other is colonization. And we have to understand the difference between both of them. Exploitation is when you exploit somebody of your own race. Colonization is when you exploit somebody of a different race. We are colonized. We are so dehumanized, we cannot say, yes, we hate you for what you have done to us.
In the beginning of 1968, after selling Mao's Red Book to university students in order to buy shotguns, the party makes the book required reading. By the end of the year, the party has swelled from 400 members to over 5,000 members and 45 chapters and branches, with a newspaper circulation of 100,000 copies. 8 members. The party does little to separate its legal and illegal aspects, and is thus always and everywhere under attack by the government.
Flames of protest, literally and figuratively, burned out of control on the streets of New Haven and more than 100 other U.S. cities.
In 1967, 126 cities were hit by racial violence, with 75 incidents classified as major riots.
A police informant in New Haven was murdered during an undercover investigation of Black Panther activities. Panther Party chairman Bobby Seale and others were accused of murdering the informant. A highly publicized criminal trial in New Haven attracted radical protest groups.